I think like many people, I've had a pretty challenging past couple of years. Actually, if I'm honest with myself, I was going through a lot of ups and downs well before the pandemic, like years before that. It felt like it had been so long since I could say that I consistently felt happy. But even talking about this now, there's a part of me that almost can't help but to challenge myself on this. I hear this voice inside my mind saying things like, come on, other people have it so much harder than you. You have nothing to complain about. You're just taking things for granted and not appreciating what you have. And I think this is one reason why we tend to dismiss the idea of going to therapy. We can have this built-in response that tells us that we shouldn't be complaining, that if we have any kind of problems, we should be able to handle them ourselves because, after all, they're not that big of a deal. And if we can't do it ourselves, no one can. Unless, of course, you're just too weak or you have some serious mental issues. This video is about how my views about therapy have changed, why I started to go, and why I think everyone should consider it. Reason 1, rewiring the inner voice. First off, I think I need to provide a bit more context to that inner voice I mentioned earlier. For me, just becoming more aware that I have this inner voice, as well as becoming more aware of when it decides to chime in on my mind, was an accomplishment of its own. We all have this inner voice. Sometimes we visualize it as the cartoon angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other, but most of the time it's simply those instantaneous moments of self-talk that occur almost on a subconscious level as we move through life. To someone that has a decent amount of confidence and love for themselves, this voice can be the tiny push of encouragement that tells you to pull your shoulders back, put a friendly smile on, and introduce yourself to that person across the room. Or it can be a brief moment of thanks and gratitude that just crosses over your awareness as you enjoy a quiet moment with someone you really care about. That voice keeps you in the present moment. It honors you and accepts you for who you are. But if we're not careful, this self-talk can lead us in a very different direction. Instead of approaching that person we'd like to meet, this inner voice can ever so quietly point out that we don't look our best right now. It reminds us that we always hate those awkward silences that happen when you've run out of things to say. Rather than gratitude, this inner voice likes to whisper in your ear that you're too skinny or too fat, too short or too tall, that your friends are all making more money than you are, that the people you see around you are happier than you are, or that you're just taking far too long to figure out your life. But this inner voice isn't simply the result of having self-confidence or not. That's far too shallow of an explanation. For most of us, that inner voice that you have is an echo of some outer voice that actually spoke real words of either encouragement or discouragement to you as a kid. It was the feedback that came from a parent or someone else that you relied upon for safety and guidance as a child, like a teacher, a friend that you looked up to, or an older sibling. And throughout the many pivotal moments in our young lives, those external voices started to hardwire themselves into our minds, over time becoming the default patterns and behaviors that we inadvertently carry with us as adults. These voices are often the reason that we can't take a compliment, jumping to point out what we did wrong when somebody praises us for what we did right. They're often the reason we feel the need to remind ourselves that everyone is going to judge us if we're not dressed a certain way. Why we double down on the hurtful thing that we just said in an argument instead of simply apologizing for it. Or why we hold ourselves back from trying something new, convincing us that it's better to play it safe and that failure would be far too much to bear. For me, I've realized that I can be unnecessarily hard on myself at times. In fact, much harder than I would ever be to a friend or loved one. There's this kind of twisted logic that while I should be encouraging and supportive, stern yet compassionate with others, calling myself an idiot, silently yelling at myself for small mistakes, or telling myself that I'm too young or too inexperienced to know what I'm talking about is somehow exactly what I need. Now, I fully realize that sometimes a tough love approach or a kind of slap of reality can be a good thing, a productive thing. And perhaps that's what I think I'm giving to myself. But when taking an honest look back at my life, my habits, my doubts and insecurities, my anxieties over the future, it's hard to say that these patterns have actually helped me to be exactly the type of person that I want to be. It's hard to say that I've treated myself in the way that brings out the best in me. But because these types of patterns take place in the subconscious and are thus difficult to notice, and because they often come from people and events that we either don't remember very well or prefer not to revisit at all, it's really challenging for somebody to rewire that inner voice without some kind of help or support. And so therapy started to seem like it could be a useful tool to start that rewiring process, to start the process of becoming aware of how we treat ourselves and how we treat others, and to start the process of understanding why we are the way that we are. Reason 2, understanding our emotions. The more I learn about human psychology, the more I realize that everyone is a product of the emotions that we've experienced throughout our lives. Many of us, including myself, have a tendency to see emotions as a form of weakness, as the opposition to facts, and as those messy things that shouldn't matter when having a discussion. Sayings such as, "facts don't care about your feelings," come to mind. But I also want to share a very personal example of this. I tend to be someone that easily gets tired from small talk, gossip, conversations about who's marrying who, or someone being funny and entertaining simply for the purpose of always wanting to be funny and entertaining. Instead, perhaps sometimes to a fault, my mind gravitates towards conversations of the future, asking thought-provoking questions, diving deep into why we do the things that we do, and exploring abstract concepts. Over time, I've realized that a lot of other people find this exhausting, boring, pointless, unnecessarily analytical, and irrelevant to day-to-day life. But throughout my life, I've found that I would always gravitate towards the kinds of conversations that my father likes to have, because I think our minds work similarly. You'd often find him at the dinner table discussing what I thought were stimulating subjects and bigger ideas. But I began to feel that it was impossible to have a calm, rational debate with him. At some point, you couldn't fully explore a topic because unless you agreed with him on everything, he would start becoming hurtful, inconsiderate, and increasingly irrational. He would have a way of trying to break you down, attacking your character instead of the argument, and simply trying to feel victorious and in control no matter what the cost. The conversation would eventually die because he would look you in the eye and tell you, "I don't give a shit what you think." And when the inevitable sadness and frustration of being blatantly disregarded by your father would creep up on you, he would view those emotions as an opportunity to shut you down and invalidate everything you just said to him. The reason I wanted to include this personal example is because, for me, it highlights something very important. As I get older, I'm starting to understand that emotions are simply part of the human condition. They're practically inescapable for all of us, even those that look down on them. Heck, for a human being, they just might be what makes life worth living. I mean, don't you enjoy feeling happy? Don't you get energy from feeling motivated? Would happiness and motivation have any meaning if you never felt sadness or fear? Would you want a life void of emotions? Certainly, emotions shouldn't just be simply dismissed as irrelevant and weak. And ironically, it's the adults that I grew up with that have inadvertently started to paint a clearer picture that we all are emotional creatures, and that the ones that seem to value logic and a lack of emotions the most feel just as much as those that wear their emotions on their sleeves. It's just that they've spent a lifetime practicing how to push them deeper and deeper into the shadows of their psyche. For example, I look at my father and see someone that tries so hard to project strength, stability, and intelligence. Yet, as I've come to learn more about his past from the people around him, I realize that there is so much repressed emotion underneath the surface. How do I know? How do I know that he's not just simply at peace with who he is and has nothing worth fixing, like he would want you to believe? Well, 2 reasons. The amount of people I know that feel resentment over his words and actions, and the ease with which you can go from having a reasonable discussion with him to him exploding in anger. Maybe you know someone like this as well. But I think I'm starting to get it. I can see why many of my friends express similar sentiments about their parents or people in their lives too. While it seems like now we're finally starting to talk about mental health in a less judgmental way, our parents' generation didn't have that. Many of our parents were hit and threatened with violence, as if pain comes with no negative consequences, only the motivation to correct behavior. Many of our fathers were told to be a man, which meant pushing aside and repressing their emotions. Many of our mothers were told to obey, to be dutiful, and to know their place in a man's home. I have so many friends whose parents had escaped civil wars that understandably hardened them from feeling any empathy towards a younger generation that simply didn't have it as bad as they did. They came from a generation when only those labeled as crazy or screwed up went to therapists or psychologists, and many of them spent their entire lives repressing feelings of anger, sadness, neglect, fear, and distrust. Many of them were taught that there's no point in looking into the past, and that trying to understand those feelings is weak. So much so that they hardly think there's anything new to understand about themselves at all. Sadly, it's only the people on the outside that can clearly see the manifestation of all that hurt. And so, I sought therapy because I don't want to spend a lifetime with repressed emotions that get passed down to the next generation. I want to understand them so that I have the power to change them. Reason 3, seeking a space for change. Lastly, I sought therapy because I wanted someone with a background in psychology and experience in helping people understand their issues to ask me new questions that I never considered, or to ask the questions that I'm afraid to ask myself. I wanted someone to notice the ways in which I deflect, avoid, and brush over details of my life, and then encourage me to turn towards those things, to dig a little bit deeper into the conversations that make me uncomfortable. I wanted a safe, non-judgmental space to explore my thoughts, my emotions, my memories. A space that is purely for me, where I don't have to feel that social pressure of worrying that I'm taking up too much of the conversation, prompting me to say things like, "Enough about me, let's talk about you." I wanted a space so that I could have the freedom to really, as my therapist writes in his website, let go of the burdens that keep us from living our fuller, self-realized lives. But you know what's funny is that even after I've started attending therapy sessions, there is still this part of me that is shy to talk about it with others. There's a part of me that feels just a little bit embarrassed to say that I'm going to therapy, as if it will draw this extra attention to myself and admit to everyone that there must be something wrong with me. But I've been thinking about that feeling. I've been thinking, we go to the doctor to take care of our physical health. Sometimes we go because there's a serious problem, and sometimes we go just to check up on things and make sure that we stay ahead of those problems. And some of us turn to personal trainers or nutritionists to go above and beyond and to optimize our health. So why should our mental health be any different? I believe that the therapy office can be that place that we go to in order to take care of and optimize our mental health and ultimately help us grow. And so I've been going to therapy once a week for about 9 months now. We've talked about everything from family and intimate relationships to work and dreams of the future. I've been able to safely express feelings of anger, guilt, and fear. And when I do, I often find that it's easier to move on to feelings of gratitude, realization, and hope. We're moving past the old, outdated ways of handling our emotions and our past the way that previous generations did. I want to break that cycle. I look around me and it seems apparent that the world would be a much better place if more of us were willing to be vulnerable and to take an honest look at where our beliefs, patterns, quirks, behaviors, and tendencies really come from. It seems like only then will we have the freedom to choose what we perpetuate and what we change. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you got something out of this video. This was very cathartic for me to share, but I think a lot of people that at least are in my circle are talking more and more about mental health, and I think it's great to see that it's come up to the surface more and people are willing to just share their experiences and consider things like going to therapy. I really do think it's needed, particularly in this time that we're going through. But anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.